Our lead story again. We're hearing from the family now of Edward Henry. This is for the first time. Family, friends, community members tonight attended a protest outside of OPD headquarters.
First Alert 6's Philip Katafamo is there and shares what questions they still want answered.
A family in mourning as they seek more answers in the death of a loved one.
When it comes to the energy and who you just always wanted to be around, that's my uncle.
Today, Omaha police showed body camera footage to the public of when officers arrested 54-year-old Edward Henry Tuesday night. An autopsy revealed Henry died of a heart attack in Douglas County Jail 8 hours after being booked for felony burglary. Family member Stephen Henry wants to know the exact timeline from when his uncle was detained to when he was in jail.
In that news conference, they said that he cleared for medical through OPD before released into Omaha Corrections custody. Then what happened from the point he got into that correctional building up into that unit?
Another family member I spoke with expressed frustration over the arrest itself. They have questions about the use of force and how the incident went down.
How can you possibly say that there was no contact to his neck? No matter what angle you look at, no matter how fast you play the video, you see a knee on his neck.
Chief Schmaderer said what officers did to get control of someone who they said was resisting arrest.
There was a knee on his head for really a brief period of time, and that was to control his head. When you can control the head, you control the body.
The remaining body cam footage won't be seen until after the grand jury process, which can take weeks, if not months, to happen. Some direct family members have seen body camera footage of the arrest. Chief Schmaderer says he used an emergency exception to release the video for transparency. Schmaderer has been working with Omaha Senator Ashley Spivey to get body cam footage released quicker.
I can understand that why you may wait to release things publicly because of a pending investigation or not to, tamper a potential jury body for a grand jury. However, folks are wanting closure. Folks are needing answers. And there's a lot of mistrust, rightfully so.
Senator Spivey hopes to get something in front of lawmakers in January. In downtown Omaha, I'm Philip Katafamo, First Alert 6.
Senator Spivey says she will continue working with law enforcement and the community on this reform. She also plans to keep communicating with the community on what changes they would like to see. Again, you can find full coverage on everything we've learned today on this case on our website, firstalert6.com.